Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I am your host Deepak. We are delighted to welcome two distinguished faculty members to join us on today's podcast episode. Our first guest on today's episode is Professor Bryan Bollinger, Professor of Marketing and George A. Kellner Faculty Fellow at the Leonard N School of Business, New York University. In addition to his faculty role, Professor Bollinger serves as the academic director of doctoral education, where he leads and shapes the next generation of academic leaders in marketing. Professor Bollinger's research has been featured in leading academic journals, including Marketing Science, Management Science, Journal of Marketing Research, Journal of Marketing, Quantitative Marketing and Economics, American Economic Journal, Economic Policy and Nature. His work has also been highlighted by prominent media outlets such as The Economist, NPR, The New York Times, and Harvard Business Review. Professor Bollinger earned his BA and BE in engineering from Dartmouth College, followed by an MA in economics and PhD in marketing from Stanford University. Our second guest for this episode is Professor Kelly Gulo-Wai. Professor Kelly is a Boston Scientific pre-tenure scholar and assistant professor of marketing at Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. She holds a PhD in marketing from Duke University and specializes in experimental research on how time and close relationships influence consumer behavior and well-being. Her work has been published in top marketing journals such as the Journal of Consumer Research, Journal of Marketing Research, Journal of Consumer Psychology, and Journal of Public Policy and Marketing. In this episode, both faculty members will share valuable insights from their research study on the topic, Can social media messaging help save our environment? Professor Bryan Bollinger and Professor Kelly Gulo-Wai, it is a true honor and pleasure to have you both on the podcast.
Pleasure to
Thank
be
you for
here.
having us.
Professor Bryan and Professor Kelly, can you briefly explain the key objectives of your study on social media messaging and its impact on energy conservation?
Sure. So I can give some background on this project. So this was a collaboration that we were doing initially with a nonprofit organization, Smart Power, and the CEO of that organization, Brian Keene, following up on some of the work that our other co-author, Ken Gillingham, and I had done looking at the diffusion of solar panels within Connecticut as part of the Solarize programs. And we partnered with a utility to study the effect of the Rhode Island Energy Challenge, which leveraged social connections to try to get people to find their four energy saving options. And it was a terrific collaboration with Kelly, where we could then go into the lab and look at some of these psychological drivers that would lead people to commit to four energy saving actions that they might take in an attempt to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Professor Kelly, how crucial is behavioral change when it comes to addressing the climate crisis?
I think there's a lot of things that will have to change to address the climate crisis. But behavioral change is really kind of the underpinning of all of it. We need organizations to change, we need government systems to change, and we need individual people to change their habits, which is really kind of what this particular study is looking at. We need individuals to get on board and to help drive the change from the ground up.
Professor Bryan, your study mentions two key factors, the recipient's connection to the sender and the inclusion of social proof. Can you elaborate how these factors influence the effectiveness of social media messages?
Absolutely. And so when the Find Your Four Challenge was designed, we thought that it could be quite effective to work with organizations that people were part of, because it was a way to have a trusted information source talk to you about the ways that you might be able to reduce your energy usage, things like installing, double pane or triple pane windows, adjusting your thermostat, looking at solar adoption, if you want to look at sort of bigger activities. And it can be hard to reach individuals. We as marketing professors know it can be really hard to get people to even consider, engaging in the type of behavioral change that Kelly's talking about. And then as you go down that purchase funnel, trying to get them to actually make those changes. And so, as part of the partnership, we worked with the towns that people lived in. We worked with churches. We worked with businesses where they worked, so that when they got messages that talked about ways that they might save energy, they were getting it from a more trusted source with individuals that they could identify with. And that leads to the social proof aspect, where when you see someone else, especially someone from an in-group, someone who has things in common with you, you might be more persuaded to make the kind of changes that are needed to address this issue.
Yeah. Professor Brain, why are messages from familiar groups like local employers or community organizations more impactful than those from anonymous sources?
I think a lot of it comes down to the trust of the source. The combination of the trust of the source, and then also seeing that someone who might have similar circumstances to you engage in those activities, which then suggests that this might be a good thing for you to consider as well.
Professor Kelly, how does incorporating social proof showing that others are taking positive environmental actions amplify the impact of social media messaging?
Yeah, so there's a lot of prior work. We're certainly not the first that demonstrate that social proof can influence people's behavior stronger than if you don't have social proof. So if you hear that other people maybe like you are engaging in some kind of behavior, we're more likely to engage in it ourselves. But we think that it is especially influential on social media messaging, because when we are getting onto social media, we are engaging with our social network, right? We're trying to see what other people are doing. And we're already kind of in that mindset. And I think, kind of building off what Bryan was talking about, what we find in this research is that social proof is particularly effective when it's coming from an in-group, as opposed to maybe an anonymous source, like you mentioned, or maybe a group that you're less connected with, like some kind of national nonprofit that you don't have direct ties to. When a group that you are affiliated with is telling you how other people in your group how they are behaving, it makes it feel like that kind of messaging is, or that kind of behavior is normative. And so we really think that this is what's driving the behavior. Not only are we learning about engaging in energy saving behaviors from an in-group, we're also learning that other people in our community are engaging in this way. And we're learning about it on a platform where we're already connected and trying to be social, like on social media. So I think all of these together kind of really drive this effect.
Professor Brain and Professor Kelly, are there specific examples where social proof has been used successfully to encourage energy conservation or other pro-environmental behaviors?
Well, absolutely. And I guess I'll turn back to the solar panel example. Within these solarized campaigns in Connecticut that Ken and I studied, we at one point were trying to look at, what characteristics of the key ambassadors, those volunteers who are on the ground talking to people, what characteristics were the most important in leading others to buy in and adopt solar themselves. And so this was a collaboration with Gordon Kraft Todd, Ken Gillingham, as I mentioned, Stefan Lamp, and David Rand, which we published in Nature. And we were looking again at, in this case, a non-normative behavior. Adopting solar is not yet widespread. And we found in that study that when that key solar ambassador adopts solar technology themselves, that changes the beliefs about how others perceive your beliefs. So we refer to it as second order beliefs. Your beliefs about my beliefs, about the importance of that behavior. And with additional experimental studies, we verified that as the mechanism. And this goes beyond just green technologies or energy conservation. It can be true in things like buying carbon offsets for flights, wearing a face mask when you're sick, other non-normative behaviors. And then eventually you can shift those to become more normative, where we expect others to engage in that behavior and leverage those appeals to social norms that Ken and Kelly and I tried to look at in this study in Rhode Island.
And I'll add to that, I think beyond just what we've seen in research, one of my favorite examples of when social proof has been really successful in encouraging pro-environmental behaviors is Greta Thunberg. So Greta, as a teenager, started a huge social media campaign to try to get other students like her to go on strikes for the environment, and that turned into a massively successful social media campaign to raise awareness. And so we're seeing examples of this both in other research and kind of happening live in the world.
Some of the examples that I think a lot of us are familiar with I use in class is those examples when hotels ask you to participate in water-saving activities and not have your linens changed every day, which went from a very non-normative type of behavior to something that is quite widespread now. And again, appealing to people who were in a similar group to you, business travelers when you're a business traveler, someone with kids, if you have kids yourself and you're traveling, those
or
appeals
even people who've stayed in that specific room.
Absolutely.
Professor Brain, social media platforms allow for targeted messaging at scale. How can organizations leverage this influence, energy-saving behavior in diverse communities?
I mean, one of the reasons why we were excited to look at the Rhode Island Energy Challenge was the fact that you can scale up the social media communications a lot more than you can scale up the one-to-one kind of conversations that were part of the Solarize programs. That said, it's still, as you mentioned, very effective for targeting. So one thing that can be done is to make specific types of appeals depending on the individual that maybe come from a group that they are a member of, or that specifically address a barrier to adoption that might be specific to them. And if you can show that someone else that is similar to them was able to overcome that barrier and make that change, it allows you to have a more compelling message. And that message might be different for you or for me or for Kelly. And again, the low cost of social media exposures allows you to then scale.
Professor Kelly, what are some potential challenges or limitations in using social media to promote energy conservation?
This is a great question, and I think there's kind of two ways to think about it. The first is just using social media as a messaging or a marketing communication platform as a whole. I teach digital marketing here at Indiana University, and one of the things that me and my students talk about a lot is just how much content gets put on social media every single second of the day. So even if there's a lot of reasons that social media could be very effective, you still have to cut through all the clutter of all the other conversation. But even assuming that you're able to design a campaign or reach out to your audience in an effective way on social media, which of course there's lots of ways to be able to do that. I think another potential challenge here, more specific to the current study, is if your social media audience has kind of a blending of two different groups. And I'll expand on what I mean by that. I actually just met with the Department of Transportation for Indiana University, a representative. I met with her Friday. And a challenge that she is facing is that she's wanting to leverage actually the insights from this research to get people to carpool more or use bikes instead of modes of transportation that are less environmentally worse for the environment. And she has noticed that students are less likely to drive and faculty and staff are more likely to drive. And so she can't use social media to specifically target faculty. The social media channels are going to reach out to both groups of our community here at Indiana University. And so I think to the extent that social media doesn't allow you to specifically target a certain group, which is possible for some groups or some communities, that could be a challenge. We instead talked about maybe combining these results with other forms of messaging so they can have their social media campaign, but also maybe reach out to individual colleges at the university, right? We're a very large university. So she can have the business school or the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences reach out to faculty via email or other modes of communication that allow us to specifically target faculty, but still come kind of these more fine-grained community groups.
Professor Brain, how can organizations ensure that their social media messaging is authentic and doesn't lead to misinformation or greenwashing?
It's a great question. It goes a little bit farther afield than what our study is about. Although our affiliate groups included, in addition to towns and religious organizations and town organizations, it did include businesses. It was on the employee side, and so the messages that came to individuals were not to a customer base, but to the employee group, talking about the types of things that other employees had done as well, which created that in-group status. If we're going to talk about sort of larger social media communication by firms, this is where intent and perceived intent sort of comes into play a little bit. Consumers are going to often think about what the firm is trying to achieve by those communications. Are they trying to sell something? And then in terms of greenwashing, it's a very hot topic right now. I teach a class here at NYU called Marketing and Sustainability, and greenwashing is something that many firms have been accused of. On the other side, you have green hushing, where firms don't want to talk about the sustainable things that they're doing because they don't want to be accused of greenwashing, or they don't want consumers to know that their product has changed in any way. And so being authentic, I know it's a little circular in terms of the logic, but that's the best thing it can do to avoid greenwashing. If you're trying to promote something or some kind of behavior on one hand, and then your products are promoting a lifestyle that conflicts with that, or if you're lobbying, and your lobbying activities are in direct conflict with the message that you're trying to send on social media, consumers will often see through that, if not in the short run, in the long run. And so I think if you want to avoid greenwashing, you have to make sure that you are walking the walk.
Professor, could this approach be extended to other social issues such as public health or social justice? And what lessons can we learn from this research?
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak to a research project from one of my colleagues and co-authors at North Carolina State, Stacy Wood. We did a project looking at the effect of celebrity breast cancer diagnoses on people's decision to then go get mammograms and other health care. She had a separate project looking at how to sort of message public health interventions for those who had a barrier to adoption, similar to what you might expect with sustainable behaviors such as the Find Your 4 Energy Challenge. The context that she was looking at was COVID vaccines, and found that if you were trying to change the mind of someone who was wary to take the vaccine, and if some of that hesitancy came from political ideology, pointing to someone who shared a political ideology with that person, and that they might have engaged in that activity, in this case, taking the COVID vaccine, could then sort of shift that person much more effectively than other types of messaging. And so it absolutely has applicability outside of the energy space.
Professor Kelly, how important is collaboration between government, business, and communities in delivering effective social media campaigns for environmental conservation?
I think this really kind of brings us full circle to how we started this conversation about the importance of behavioral change. I mentioned, we need individuals to change, but also organizations and government systems. And I think what this study really highlights is that it does have to be a concerted effort and maybe a combined effort across all of these different groups of people. And this is especially true with social media campaigns, because as I mentioned, it's really difficult to cut through the clutter. But if we can find other groups that can help to amplify the message and spread the message, maybe, if it's my employer or if it's my church, I might be more likely to see their posts than I would from some other maybe nonprofit or group that I'm not specifically affiliated with. And so it can be really important that we have this coordination in order to spread the word, especially on social media.
Professor Bryan and Professor Kelly, my last question. What message would you like to share with individuals, businesses, and policymakers who are interested in using social media to tackle the climate crisis?
mean, Kelly referred to some of the sort of important aspects in terms of even people seeing your messages, right? So something that's coming from a group that you're part of, you're more likely to see that message on most platforms. We don't know the details of the algorithms, but first you need to get people to see the message, engage with it to some degree. And again, in our study, it's a lot more than just a message, right? That message, the ones that were effective, the ones that appealed to social proof, coming from an affiliate group, that was tied to actual behavioral change from other individuals. And so when you have a social media message that's tied to actual change, I think that's when you actually see the ability to have much more effective communication.
Now, I'll just add on that a little bit. We see some evidence in our study that trying to appeal to social proof when you are not a part of that community or in group can occasionally backfire. So you can imagine if a nonprofit that's just kind of this national nonprofit tells you that X% of people in your community are engaging in a behavior, that can either mitigate the effectiveness of the social proof, or we find in some cases it can even backfire to where I'm now less likely to engage in the energy saving behavior. Who are you to tell me what my community does? And so I think for any policymakers or businesses wanting to use this kind of messaging, it's important to also think about your relationship to the audience that you're reaching out to and your decision about whether or not to include social proof in your message.
As we wrap up today's episode of the Business Talk podcast, I want to extend my heartfelt thank you to distinguished guests, Professor Bryan Bollinger and Professor Kelly Gulovai. Their insights into how social media messaging can drive meaningful environmental change have provided us a deeper understanding of the role that digital platforms play in promoting sustainability. Thank you to both professors for sharing your expertise and to our listeners for joining us. Stay tuned for more thought-provoking discussions. Until next, I am Deepak signing off. Thank you so much, Professor Bryan and Professor Kelly.
Thank you, Deepak.
Thank you.